One. Technically, reporter Michael Butler, I hear you're working on a story and you wanted to circle up a little bit. What are you working on?
Yeah, so I'm writing a story right now on Philly fighting COVID. It's a
Oh,
hot topic.
who is it?
Yeah. Oh man, yeah, it's a hot topic in Philadelphia right now. And at the core of the story, I want to peel back the layers and understand social entrepreneurship a little bit better and see what Philly fighting COVID's miscues might mean for the local social entrepreneur community.
All right, so let's unpack a couple of things. One, I mean, maybe for the folks at home who are living under a rock, what? Give us the quick hit. What is Philly fighting COVID?
Yeah, so Philly fighting COVID is a an organization. I almost like misidentified them. I had to be careful, but Philly Fighting COVID is an organization that started at last year, sometime in the very beginning of the pandemic, using 3D printers to create PPE, and that's equipment for people to safely do things and breathe, what have you, given the circumstances. At some point, they made an arrangement with the city of Philadelphia to distribute the COVID-19 vaccine, and everything from there just went haywire. People weren't, the public wasn't getting the vaccine from them, and members of the organization actually used the vaccine for their own devices.
And so, yeah, in the harried rush of uh, 2020, small organization, personal protective gear, then helping with some testing. They then get to this vaccination game. Our friends at WHOI and Billy Penn did some really excellent reporting about the very strange circumstances and of the founder, Andrei Doroshin, maybe way over his head. At best case scenario, may be a nefarious actor. At worst case, that's yet to be seen. All right, so second thing we wanted to clarify, this thing is social entrepreneurship. You were getting at, we were hearing from folks who either are involved in civic technology, they're either for-profits or nonprofits who do contracts for government, including local and city governments, and some mission-minded founders, both in the for-profit and nonprofit stake, that work for institutions. And you were beginning to hear, we were hearing that people were a little bit nervous about the narrative that was developing around Philly fighting COVID and Andrei's strange uh, circumstances. What were you hearing from some of these founders in our beat?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest concerns right now is that Philly fighting COVID might have ruined the party, so to speak, for everybody like them. And when I say everybody, I mean social entrepreneurs that on paper they are very similar to what Philly fighting COVID was as an organization.
On
And because
paper,
on
meaning
paper,
group trying to solve big problem with very small beginnings. They would, yeah, on paper, yeah.
exactly. You know that, Chris. And the issue we have with that is that anytime you lack that nuance and you paint the group with a broad brushstroke, a lot of stuff gets lost in there, and bad stuff, even worse stuff happens in this case. So talking to local technologists, civic tech people, the concern is that, hey, maybe Philly fighting COVID did do some bad things, but the city could have possibly acted differently and maybe taking over the projects and actually using the infrastructure created by Philly fighting COVID for what it was meant for instead of what it became. That was one possibility that was thrown out.
So, all right. So, how the heck can I help you?
So what have you been hearing, Chris? I know your network is a little bit more expansive than mine. So what have people been sharing with you?
Well, yeah, I mean, you reporting it out, so it's always interesting to hear what you're hearing. But I guess two themes from conversations or like small text threads I'm having. One, as you alluded to, sometimes, co- all the time, complex controversies continue to get reduced and the narrative gets squeezed. So it seems that this organization that may have had nonprofit status, though there's a high bar for garnering it, so it may have been through a fiscal agent. There's some nuance there that we and others are reporting out. But let's say it had some vague status, then changed some updates, seemed to tweak some language, suddenly were described as a for-profit. That triggered some red flags and a bunch of great reporting. Shout out to Max Marin and others from HYY, but others like that change prompted a bunch of reporting and then found, wow, one of the most important public health emergencies in this city's history is being in part handled by a deeply inexperienced ragtag bunch. And then a whole bunch of other reporting came and found that there was even less and less rigor. There are allegations of vaccines being taken home. A lot of reporting is coming out as we're talking, so we'll move on. But I think the narrative of going for profit or being small, raising a flag, and then nefarious actions being found is being simplified to being because the group was small, or because the group was new, or because the group was a for-profit, that was the inherent problem. And that, I think, is one of the things that we keep hearing from for-profit firms, software firms that get government contracts that are like, show me a time when we've broken any rule. There's already high barriers. There's already heavy regulation and process for validation. We go through RFP bidding processes. We want to make these processes simpler, not more aggressive. Mm-hmm. If we get really upset about the idea of a for-profit doing this work, that can only add to the complexity here. That's one thing that I hear a whole bunch of, like, we got to get this narrative right. This is not a problem that it was a for-profit, not a problem that they were new. It's a problem that this was not the right organization to be doing this. That could happen at a non-profit, a for-profit, or a large organization, or
anywhere,
otherwise.
right?
As you alluded to that I heard you mention, the now famous Deloitte $40 million contract for the CDC. You mentioned.
Yeah. I was just talking about that with my amazing editor Julie Zeglin not long ago, and this was something brought up by one of my sources for this story, where this just happened very recently. It's all over national news. The CDC contracted the opportunity to create a vaccination data system to Deloitte, which is a gigantic firm, and they spent 44 million doing it, and it went bad, right? And what's interesting is, like, you have this situation on one end of the spectrum where you have government agencies working with much bigger, more reputed companies, and that thing not going well. And then on the other end of the situation is you have Philly fighting COVID locally, where, like you said, the ragtag bunch, they got the opportunity and they blew it. So somewhere between those two opportunities on the opposite ends of the spectrum is the middle where we need balance. Like you said, this is a nuanced thing, and just because you're for profit or you're nonprofit doesn't mean or that your business is going to be bad. And that's what we need more of in the narrative is nuance.
Right. I think that's well said. We say a lot in our newsroom that those are tax statuses, not tickets to heaven, and I think that gets lost a bunch here. The other thing that I think I'd add and would want to make sure ends up in some of your reporting, particularly when building software, but in crisis, we see this time and time again. We've seen it play out a ton over the last year. Government is always balancing mitigation of risk with opportunity for experimentation. And in American culture, we really like to tease, prod, challenge, and criticize government for a lack of innovation and experimentation. We also like to jump on any failed project, mistake, misuse of dollars that don't go anywhere. But we find that happens in the for-profit sector. We find that happens a lot of places. Turns out that humans are not robots. They don't always rationally and efficiently spend all time and dollars for perfection. That's not to say we shouldn't challenge and track and criticize how people's money is spent, but I would want to make sure your reporting gets right, because it's something that I certainly I'm hearing, that folks a lot in our beat have spent their careers trying to create an environment where government can get a little closer to that stage of experimentation and innovation, which we know will result in mistakes. A small narrative that I think I'd throw to you, Michael, that maybe
Hmm?
can inform your own perspective and reporting here. In March 2020, when the pandemic was barreling down on us, and it was very clear that state, federal, local governments were going to effectively put the economy in on ice, and it was clear that this is a worthwhile opportunity to flood the economy with fiscal stimulus. There was a lot of very thoughtful economists and, I mean, economic thinkers who were reminded we need to get this money out fast. What is going to happen is mistakes are going to be made, and if we over criticize those mistakes, all we're going to do is slow the release of funds in the future. And what happened? Our federal government put 14 years of Small Business Administration funding out in 14 days. A true incredible accomplishment of federal fiscal stimulus. You look at the numbers globally, that first wave, our country did put a bunch of fiscal stimulus out. They did it fast. That's what had to happen.
Right.
What was the result? A bunch of assholes cheated, found gray areas, did not entirely follow the spirit of that, and there's some ways that we just felt as a society that that's not how we wanted that money to get spent. And there are thoughtful conversations that improved how the spending, how other wave, the subsequent waves through Paycheck Protection Program has rolled out, and that's important. But that was a careful moment to remember, when do we want government to be fully responsible for mitigation of risk? When do we want them to move quick and or experiment and innovate? And there's a lot of words to say that I think we're seeing a little example of this here. Again, there seems like there's real mistakes here, and we need that. And I applaud the reporting that our peers are doing. I think the addition that I think you could make or you could add here, Michael, from our beat, is we do want government to be able to experiment and look at alternatives, and not everything should be done by Deloitte. Something should, but not everything should. We have to make sure we focus on the mistakes that are made and not oversolve for reducing all risk.
Absolutely.
So that's what I'd hope you'd add.
Yeah, and I appreciate your insight, Chris. That's something I'm definitely going to make sure I add to my story and my reporting. But just simply put, we want, like you said, we want to criticize. It's like in the American nature, almost, to criticize government, right? It's what the country is built upon. That's
I
great.
think everyone in the world does that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Except when the world does it. But at the same time, somewhere between the criticizing government, we need to allow room for innovation. And so, like you said, if we don't take calculated risk, we're not going to innovate, and we're going to get left behind. So that's been a recurring theme from the sources I've spoken to so far, is just the need for innovation, but at the same time, responsible innovation. So what does that look like? It still remains to be seen.
Well said. Well, Michael, I hope I added something. I look forward to reading your story.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Yeah, see you.
See ya.